You will regret becoming a Canadian non-resident is the most common negative question that I got when I made the announcement that I am planning on becoming a Canadian non-resident before the end of this year. And who knows? Maybe it will be. Maybe I will just greatly regret this decision for reasons that I obviously am not privy to at this point in time, because obviously nobody knows what the future is going to bring. But what I also know is to not trust random people on the internet who don't actually know my specific case and who are not me and can't make decisions for me. So on this one, I'm going to trust myself. I'm going to go with, my own knowledge of my particular situations and why I do think that this is going to be a great decision for me, at least for the time being. For anybody who is potentially thinking about doing this, I hope today's video will be thought-provoking to you, where I am going to cover 10 really important points, or even questions, I should say, whether non-residency is really the right decision for you. Starting with number one, and this is a very, very important thing to make sure you understand, and that is the difference between citizenship, residency, and tax residency. Having read a lot of the comments that I've gotten on my series so far, there's a lot of people that don't seem to understand the difference between all of those things, because they can all be the same, or sometimes they can be all completely different. So your citizenship, that is almost always the country that you were born into, that you received a passport from, and that most likely you have lived most of your life in. So in my particular case, I was actually born in Ukraine. I had a Ukrainian passport for most of my life because I could not apply for a Canadian one until I was an adult at 18 years old, because my mom actually held on to her Ukrainian citizenship because she wasn't sure if she would, stay or go. And Ukraine only allows one citizenship. So that's a very important thing to get clear on, is does your country allow you to have multiple citizenships, or is there ruling that you can only have one citizenship? I have already said how many times that I am incredibly grateful to be a Canadian citizen, and of course it is a very strong passport, so I do not lose that by becoming a non-resident. I am forever a citizen unless I chose to renounce it and become a citizen somewhere else that only allows one citizenship, or I decide to become a terrorist. Neither of those options are likely. Now, residency. Residency usually applies to where is your home? Where do you have real estate? Where do you have familial bonds? Like usually your closest family, like your wife, husband, kids. Usually that's the group that they're talking about. Third, do you have bank accounts in that country? Do you have a driver's license? Do you have health care in that country? And also, is your business in that country? That is something that every country will take into consideration before they call you a tax resident. Now, this is the part that I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on just yet. This is something, that can get very complex depending on how you decide to structure your company, for all specific reasons. So in my particular case, with the country that I'm going to be moving to, it is going to be both my residency and also my tax residency. That is almost always the easiest way to go about things. So the point that I'm trying to get across is make sure you understand the difference between those three categories, and the rules around all of that can range depending on the country that you're from. Now, question number 2, when you are considering becoming a non-resident of any country, what is your why? Why are you doing this? why are you leaving your country? Obviously, there must be some kind of reason. I don't think people just randomly decide to make a decision like this and move abroad, especially if you do live in a privileged, wealthy country like Canada. I do understand why some people will kind of look at my decision as, kind of crazy, doesn't really make sense to them. And I get that because there are so many benefits to living in this country, but I think people have to understand that it really depends on whether your job is in Canada. Like if I had, a job that was central to Canada, that would be that. But if you have your own business that you can be anywhere in the world to do, and especially if it requires moving around as much as mine does, no, Canada really is not at all the best fit for that specific scenario, even just, location-wise. But when you take into consideration the current, cost of living, of course it's happening all over the world, but Canada is still one of the most expensive countries to live in, especially when it comes to the real estate. The taxes are also quite high here. And third, I'm not saying this particular one applies to me super strong, but of course, if you don't really agree with the government policy in your country, if there's some kind of social issues going on. And lastly, I think one of the other really common reasons for people becoming non-residents is they are just looking for new opportunities, depending on the kind of business you have, or maybe it's just a lifestyle sort of opportunity of just maybe trying to be around a different group of people. Now, point number 3 might actually be the most important question on this list. I mentioned the other two first because you should ask yourself those questions first, but this one's probably the most important one, which is how will you survive? There are some people on the internet that think it's just easy to move abroad and life is so much cheaper in all these other countries. If I'm coming from Canada or US, like I can easily live off my savings or, retirement funds. And sure, sometimes that is the case. Some people do have a lot in savings or have really good investments that they are getting, monthly dividends from. But in a lot of other cases, I think people greatly underestimate just how much money it is going to cost not only to become a non-resident, because you will have a capital gains tax if you have a lot of assets here in Canada. I'll kind of touch on that later. You very likely will also have to pay for an immigration lawyer to help you with your paperwork, to get the permissions to be able to make this kind of move. You'll obviously have your flights, getting set up in a new living environment, whether you choose to rent or buy real estate, furnished, unfurnished. So all of those things can be very big expenses on top of the fact of how will you pay for your day-to-day life to live in that country. It's usually only once you've gotten permanent residency, citizenship, or you're going there specifically on a work visa, which is usually sponsored by another company. So if you're like me, where you're basically a digital nomad, your whole business is online, it doesn't really affect what's going on in that country, almost for sure you will be able to do that kind of work and become, a tax resident of that country. You could set up a company in that regard. Usually there are some barriers around you as a foreigner going to another country and taking locals' jobs, unless that country really needs that and they're asking people to come on specific visas for that reason. Now, question number 4 really does actually tie with my last point, and it is, are you able to get a residency permit in the country that you want to live in? Now, if you guys watched my last video where I touched on why Southeast Asia ended up being cut as an area of the world to live in, one of the big reasons for it was the fact that it's either very difficult or very expensive to get a permanent residency or citizenship in the majority of the countries there. So that was a big reason of why I decided to go with Eastern Europe, because they had a few more options that made sense for me on many different levels, including the fact that quite a few long stay visas usually could turn to permanent residency after about 5 years. I just felt like if I'm going to be investing so much in this move and I really want to feel, solid that this is a country where I could potentially buy real estate and that I could spend my retirement maybe, I wanted the confidence that I have the paperwork to actually live here. Now, point number 5 is, how will this affect your social connections? Luckily, in my case, I am single as a Pringle, and I do not have to take into consideration anybody else's opinion on this matter. I can choose for myself if I want to make this move. If I was married, if I had children, that would be a whole other story. Now, of course, in my case, I still have, my family here in Canada. I have my mom and dad. I also have my family in Ukraine, which is, one of the main reasons of why I chose Eastern Europe, because I do want to be close to them. I have friends kind of all around the world. Of course, a good chunk of them are here in Canada, but my friends are all kind of sprinkled around, and my parents are also kind of toying with the fact of where are they going to retire in the future as well. Are they going to stay in Canada? Are they going to move? Social connections really are an important factor to take into consideration, and even if you are just fully single, you have no friends, you have no family, I'm so sorry, and you're just sick of your country and you're moving to a new place, you're ready to make new friends, maybe meet a significant other, really think about whether this is a place where you can do that easily. Now, point number 6 can either be kind of easy or really, really complicated, depending on your particular case. You really need to think about, how will this move affect your bank accounts and your investments? It's actually a great benefit if you don't have any real estate, if you don't have any super complex investments, if you don't have, like corporations or anything like that here in Canada, or things like trusts. All of that begins to be really muddy with what you should do in terms of becoming a non-resident. Luckily, I don't have any real estate. I never incorporated my company. I'm just a sole proprietor, so I don't have that to deal with. And with my bank accounts, and I think this is the case in other countries too, but once again, do your own research. You can keep your bank accounts in the country that you're from, but you just can't have any like savings accounts or any kind of investment accounts, because those obviously have the potential to make you money, meaning that you would have to pay income tax on that. Now, point number 7 is important to think about whether you are young or old, and that is your pension. This is once again a point where I would recommend you consult with, Service Canada or your own tax consultant that you really trust to give you information about your specific case. So I have worked and filed a tax return here in Canada for 15 years, including this year, and I have contributed a good chunk of money to CPP, which is the Canadian Pension Plan, and then I should technically qualify for OAS, which is Old Age Security, once I reach 65. Now, to fully qualify for an OAS pension, you need 40 years of work experience. So if I was to get any money from that fund, I would only qualify for about 40% of the payment if I never came back to Canada and, contributed to the tax system here. But there is a caveat, and this is very important to understand. For the OAS, they have a rule where to get whatever kind of portion, you need a minimum of 10 years of working in Canada after the age of 18. But that is only for people who choose to retire in Canada. You have to work at least 20 years in Canada after the age of 18 to qualify to receive it abroad. So in my particular case, if I never come back to Canada and, file another tax return here, I would not qualify to get any sort of amount unless I live, work, and pay taxes in a country that has a social security agreement with Canada. Because what it helps you do is that any years that you contribute to that other country, like, living, paying taxes legally, all that kind of stuff, those years will help you meet the minimum threshold to get whatever portion of pension that you have in, your former country. So in my particular case, having only 15 years of work experience here in Canada, I need at least 5 more to qualify to get just that specific portion of money. By living and working in another country, that does not mean the Canadian government will pay me any more money. I still will only get that 40% unless I move back. But because they have that agreement, let's say I work 5 years in that country with a social security agreement, that moves over to help me meet my Canadian threshold. I hope that made sense. Like, basically, you want your new country to have as good of, political and social ties to your country as possible, because usually that will mean that you don't have the double taxation to worry about. And ideally, it also doesn't have the problem of the tax withholding on a pension. If you choose to retire abroad, the majority of countries actually have a tax withholding kind of issue that you will come across, where you can still receive your pension, but it will be taxed at 25%. So just keep that in mind, and just make sure that you are aware of, the long-term implications of what happens to your pension. Now, point number 8 was one of the most contested topics in my last few videos, of a lot of people asking about healthcare. So in my particular case, I have, come to terms with the fact that most likely I will just get a emergency medical insurance for the first few years that I am living in the country that I am, because I don't qualify for their universal health insurance, and I won't be able to pay into it until I am a permanent resident. But either way, I do have a feeling that I will be paying out of pocket quite a bit. Like, even when I qualify for the universal care, I don't think it will be as high as the care is here in Canada. So I've just come to terms with the fact that I will have to pay for things out of pocket, and unless it is something really serious, you would be surprised how inexpensive it is compared to the out-of-pocket prices here in Canada. Basically, for the last 8 years, I have done all of my dental work abroad, and it is just crazy how much money I have saved. I have also gotten a lot of optometrist appointments abroad. I have gotten all my glasses abroad because it is just so much less expensive than it is here. I've also had quite a few checkups for different things abroad because it was just faster than trying to get a referral here in Canada. Like, that's the nice thing, that you can just, pay to walk in and see whoever you need to see. Now, point number 9, I don't really care about, but I know some of you may care about, which is, will this affect your driver's license? You guys know I don't like to drive. I don't want to have to drive in the new country that I moved to. But I did look into it, and I actually am waiting for Service Canada to give me a definitive answer on this, because in a lot of countries, the one that I'm moving to included, you don't automatically qualify to get a local driver's license. Usually that only happens once you're a permanent resident or a citizen. So if you are somewhere on a long stay visa, usually, from my understanding, you should be able to use your local, your old country's driver's license with a international permit, over it. But I don't know for sure. That's still, what I'm trying to figure out. And last, but certainly not least, guys, we're actually ending on a very important point if you are thinking of moving abroad. And that is number 10. Will you be able to adapt to the new language, culture, and rules of your new country? So just like here in Canada, there's a lot of people that go on and on about, oh, these immigrants coming here, like they don't want to adapt to our culture here. They're out here breaking rules or, circumventing things. That makes me so angry. But then the same thing can be said if you then move abroad and do the same thing that you are so very against. Unfortunately, I see this all the time in less expensive countries, is these foreigners just moving there with so much entitlement, thinking that the rules don't apply to them, and they make absolutely no effort to actually integrate themselves into the culture that they are moving to. Now, I get it as far as language, like you're not going to learn it overnight. For most people, it's going to take years. Like it's usually going to take years. I find it crazy where people will have lived 5, 10, 15, 20 years in, this new country that they chose to move to. They don't know anything about the local culture. They don't know how to speak the local language. They barely have any local friends. They just hang out with their, other foreigner friends. Please be a respectful, kind, thoughtful person when moving to another country, and really ask yourself and be honest with yourself if this is a culture that you can integrate to, that you have similar beliefs to, that you feel you can make friends with the locals, that you can uplift the society in some kind of way. Because if that's not the case, I don't think you should be moving. I don't think you should be able to go over and make problems for that country. So, we are guests in their country and we should behave accordingly. So that is my speech. That is my spiel. That is my 10 points that you should consider before becoming a Canadian non-resident. As always, I'm sure the comment section will be just full of fun, and I look forward to reading all your guys' comments. So I hope you guys found this video helpful. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and as always, keep being your own kind of beautiful. Bye, guys.